Dear friend, let me tell you about a time when doing what's right meant looking past what others expected. This is a story from 1883, when the Colorado Territory was still rough around the edges and a man's word carried more weight than his bank account. It's about Samuel Carter, a decent rancher who found himself in a situation no God-fearing person should ever witness. Sometimes the most important choices we make happen in the space of a heartbeat, when our conscience speaks louder than our common sense. This tale reminds us that human dignity isn't something that can be bought or sold, no matter what the law might say. It's a story about seeing the person behind the circumstances and having the courage to act when action is needed most. The dust hung thick in Millbrook's town square, kicked up by restless boots and the nervous shifting of horses tied to every available post. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Samuel Carter pulled his sorrel mare to a halt at the edge of the crowd, squinting through the haze at what appeared to be some kind of auction. The smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco juice mixed with the sweet scent of fresh bread from the bakery across the street. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 3 times, its bronze voice carrying across the prairie wind. "What's all the commotion, Pete?" Samuel called to the blacksmith standing nearby, his leather apron dark with sweat and soot. Pete Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt, the brown stream disappearing into dust that hadn't seen rain in weeks. "Human auction. 3 of them up for sale today." Samuel's stomach dropped like a stone thrown down a well. Human auction. Legal as Sunday service, long as they got debts to pay. Pete's voice carried no more emotion than if he were discussing cattle prices at the stockyard. Samuel dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with more force than necessary. The smell of horse sweat and leather filled his nostrils as he secured his reins to a hitching post worn smooth by countless ropes. Through the crowd, he glimpsed a makeshift platform where the auctioneer stood with his brass bell and leather-bound ledger book. Samuel had come to town for cattle business, a simple matter of buying feed and checking on a horse he'd left for shoeing. Not this. Never this. Never. But something made him push through the crowd, past farmers in patched overalls and merchants in dusty suits, past women who averted their eyes and children who stared with the frank curiosity of youth. The first 2 auctions had already concluded. A middle-aged man sold to a mining company for back taxes, his shoulders sagging with defeat as he shuffled toward his new employer. An elderly woman had been purchased by the hotel owner to work in his kitchen, her gnarled hands clutching a small bundle that contained everything she owned in the world. The smell of fear hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. "Next item," the auctioneer called, consulting his papers with the business-like manner of someone selling livestock. 1 female, approximately 22 years of age, no family debts outstanding, clean bill of health from Doc Henley. Samuel's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. Item, like she was a piece of furniture or a plow horse. Then she stepped onto the platform. Samuel had expected to see defeat in her posture, perhaps tears or trembling hands like the others before her. Instead, the young woman stood with her spine straight as a lodgepole pine, her chin lifted at an angle that spoke of something the crowd couldn't quite name. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, not a strand out of place, despite the circumstances, and her simple gray dress had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. The afternoon light caught the determined set of her jaw, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Most striking of all were her eyes, intelligent, watchful, completely without the desperate plea of someone begging for mercy. Those eyes swept the crowd with the measured assessment of someone taking careful inventory. When her gaze passed over Samuel, he felt an odd sensation, as if she were evaluating him rather than the other way around. Her look held no submission, no fear, only a quiet dignity that seemed to lift her above the sordid proceedings. "Bidding starts at $50, the auctioneer announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like an axe through wood. A voice from the back shouted, "What kind of work's she good for? Domestic service, primarily. Can read and write." The auctioneer's tone suggested these were unusual qualifications that should drive up the price. Samuel noticed how the woman's hands remained steady at her sides, how she didn't flinch when the men in the crowd made crude assessments of her appearance and potential uses. There was something almost regal in her composure, something that didn't belong in this dusty square among the tobacco-stained faces and whiskey-soured breath. A blackbird cawed from the courthouse eaves, its harsh cry seeming to mock the proceedings below. $60, called a voice from the left side of the crowd. 70 came the response from a man in a rumpled suit. Samuel watched the woman's face carefully. Still no fear, no pleading. Instead, she continued her silent catalog of the crowd, as if memorizing each face for some future reckoning. Her breathing remained steady, controlled, while around her men discussed her future like they were bidding on a milk cow. The smell of roasting meat drifted from a nearby food stand, mixing incongruously with the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. "She's pretty enough for breeding stock," slurred a drunk rancher from the next county, his words thick with whiskey and crude intent. Several men laughed harsh, ugly sounds that made Samuel's skin crawl. That was when something snapped inside Samuel Carter. His weathered hand shot up before his mind could stop it, rising above the crowd like a flag of defiance. $100? The crowd turned to stare, conversations dying mid-sentence. The drunk rancher blinked in surprise, then scowled like a child whose toy had been taken away. 110. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice came out steady and strong. 150. The auctioneer looked pleased by the sudden jump in price, his eyes lighting up with the gleam of unexpected profit. "Do I hear 160? The drunk rancher looked at Samuel's stern face and the way his hand rested on his gun belt, apparently thinking better of further competition. He mumbled something under his breath and stepped back into the crowd. "Going once for $150. The auctioneer raised his brass bell, its polished surface catching the sunlight. "Going twice." The bell rang sharp and final, its bronze voice echoing off the courthouse walls. "Sold to Mr. Carter." Samuel's stomach churned as the reality of what he'd just done settled over him like a heavy blanket. He'd purchased a human being. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders, making him feel older than his 43 years. The woman stepped down from the platform with the same measured grace she'd shown throughout the ordeal. She walked directly to Samuel, stopping exactly 3 feet away, close enough to speak privately, far enough to maintain dignity. Her approach was neither hurried nor hesitant, but purposeful, like someone keeping an appointment rather than meeting a new owner. "Mr. Carter." Her voice was cultured, the words precisely enunciated with no trace of the frontier drawl common to the territory. The sound carried the refinement of expensive education, completely at odds with her current circumstances. "Ma'am," Samuel touched his hat brim, suddenly unsure of the proper etiquette for such a situation. His mother had raised him to be polite to all ladies. But what did etiquette say about speaking to someone you'd just purchased at auction up close? He could see details the distance had hidden. Her hands were smooth and pale, the palms soft, not the hands of someone who'd spent years scrubbing floors or washing laundry. Her gray dress, while worn and faded, showed the fine stitching and quality fabric that spoke of better times. The tiny, precise repairs had been made by someone who knew needlework, not hasty field mending. Most striking were those eyes he'd noticed from across the square, clear, intelligent, and completely without the gratitude he'd expected to see. Instead, she studied him with the same careful assessment she'd given the crowd, as if trying to determine what category of man she was dealing with. "I appreciate your intervention," she said finally, choosing her words with the precision of someone accustomed to being listened to. Intervention, not rescue, not purchase, not salvation. An interesting choice of words that suggested she saw their transaction differently than most would. "Name's Grace," she added, then paused as if considering whether to say more. Her hesitation was slight but noticeable, like someone editing their words carefully. "Grace Miller." Samuel nodded, though something about the way she'd hesitated made him suspect Grace Miller wasn't the whole truth. There had been a calculation in that pause, a decision made about how much to reveal. "Samuel Carter. I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles south of here." "Much obliged. Mr. Carter." The formal politeness of her response struck him as odd. Most people in her situation would be either weeping with relief or bowing and scraping with gratitude. Grace Miller did neither. She simply stood waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to controlling difficult situations, as if she were a guest at a social gathering rather than someone who'd just been sold like livestock. The courthouse clock chimed the half hour, its steady tick marking time that seemed to move differently now. Weighted with significance, Samuel found himself staring longer than was polite, trying to solve the puzzle she represented. Everything about her, the way she spoke, carried herself. Even how she'd handled the humiliation of the auction suggested breeding and education far above what her circumstances implied. A woman with her obvious refinement didn't end up on auction blocks without extraordinary circumstances. The question was, what those circumstances might be, and whether they were following her to his ranch. "We should get the paperwork settled," Samuel said finally, gesturing toward the brick courthouse that dominated one side of the square. "Of course." Her agreement was immediate and businesslike, as if she were accustomed to handling legal matters. As they walked side by side toward the building, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he just stepped into something far more complicated than a simple act of conscience. Grace Miller walked beside him like an equal, not like property. And something in her composed silence suggested she had secrets worth keeping, secrets that might be more dangerous than he could imagine. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The courthouse smelled of leather-bound books and stale tobacco smoke. Samuel's boots echoed against the worn plank floor as the clerk slid papers across his scarred oak desk. The man's steel-nibbed pen scratched against parchment, each stroke making Samuel's collar feel tighter around his throat. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, illuminating motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The afternoon heat pressed against the building's brick walls, making the interior feel close and stifling. Terms of employment. The clerk didn't look up from his ledger, his voice carrying the boredom of someone who'd processed too many such transactions. Samuel's mouth had gone dry as autumn leaves. "General labor. Fair wages for honest work." The words sounded foreign to his own ears, as if someone else were speaking them. He glanced at Grace, who stood with her hands clasped before her, watching the legal proceedings with an attention that seemed too intense for someone simply grateful to be rescued. Her breathing was steady, controlled, but Samuel noticed how her fingers pressed together until the knuckles showed white. The clerk pressed his brass seal into red wax, the hot metal hissing against the paper. The deed was done. Samuel Carter now legally owned another human being, at least until her supposed debts were worked off. "That'll be 50 cents for the filing fee." The clerk's palm extended expectantly. Samuel counted out the coins, each one clinking against the desk like a small bell tolling. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet office outside. Grace waited beside his wagon while he folded the documents and tucked them into his vest pocket. The papers felt heavier than they should, weighted with implications he didn't want to examine too closely. Her carpetbag sat at her feet, worn leather with brass corners that caught the late afternoon light. Samuel noted the quality of the workmanship, the fine stitching along the edges. Not what he'd expect from someone with debts enough to land on an auction block. Much obliged, Mr. Carter. Grace climbed onto the wagon seat without assistance, gathering her gray skirts with practiced ease. Her movements held a fluid confidence that suggested familiarity with being helped into fine carriages rather than rough farm wagons. Samuel clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon wheels began their steady crunch over the packed dirt road leading out of Millbrook. The town's dusty streets gave way to rolling prairie, where grasshoppers clicked in the tall grass and meadowlarks called from fence posts. Grace sat beside him with perfect posture, her spine never touching the seat back. She watched the passing landscape with alert interest rather than the hollow exhaustion he'd expected from someone in her circumstances. The smell of sun-warmed earth and prairie grass filled the air, mixing with the leather scent from the wagon's traces and the familiar smell of horse sweat. Fine grazing country, Grace observed after they'd traveled several miles through gently rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers. Good water year-round. Soil holds moisture well through the dry spells. Grace nodded thoughtfully. The mineral content appears excellent for cattle nutrition. The grass has that deep green color that indicates rich earth underneath. Samuel's hands tightened on the leather reins, making the horse's ears flick backward. The observation was too knowledgeable. Too precise. How many auction girls discussed mineral content and soil composition? You know about livestock? He asked, trying to keep his voice casual. I've read about ranching. Her answer came too quickly, like she'd rehearsed it during their ride. Agricultural journals and such. Samuel's forehead creased. What domestic servant had access to agricultural journals? The pieces of Grace Miller's story weren't fitting together the way they should. They crested the hill, overlooking his spread, and Samuel felt the familiar pride swell in his chest despite his confusion. Solid log buildings with stone chimneys. Well-maintained corrals with split-rail fencing. Prime breeding stock dotting the green pastures. It wasn't the largest ranch in the territory, but it was his. Built with his own hands and honest sweat. Grace leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving systematically across the layout. She studied the placement of buildings, the separation of breeding stock from work animals, the positioning of water troughs with the methodical attention of someone who understood ranch operations. Her gaze lingered on the prize stallion in the near corral, a magnificent bay, with Arabian bloodlines that had cost Samuel 2 years' savings. Your stallion there, Grace said, nodding toward the horse. Fine conformation. Arabian bloodlines mixed with Mustang stock for hardiness. Samuel's stomach clenched like a fist. No servant girl should know Arabian from Mustang, let alone use words like conformation with such casual expertise. Some, he managed, his voice rough. Grace's cheeks flushed pink, as if she'd just realized she'd revealed too much. She dropped her gaze to her folded hands, but the damage was done. The knowledge had already spilled out, revealing cracks in whatever carefully constructed story she was telling. Samuel pulled the wagon up to his front porch, his mind racing with questions that had no comfortable answers. The house sat solid and welcoming in the late afternoon light. Its wide porch and stone chimney, speaking of stability, and honest prosperity. As Grace climbed down from the wagon, Samuel caught sight of her hands again, those smooth palms, with no calluses from hard labor. The carefully tended nails of someone unaccustomed to rough work. Grace Miller was lying about something fundamental. The question that made his throat tight with sudden apprehension was simple. If she wasn't who she claimed to be, then who was she? And what had really brought a woman with her obvious breeding and education to that auction block in Millbrook? Grace's first morning at the ranch began before dawn. Samuel heard her moving in the kitchen while he pulled on his boots, the soft clink of the cast-iron stove door opening, water being pumped from the well handle with steady, practiced strokes. No fumbling around in the dark like someone unfamiliar with kitchen work. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the house, mixed with the rich aroma of coffee brewing in the tin pot. Samuel's stomach rumbled as he laced his boots, the leather stiff from yesterday's dust. By the time he reached the main room, Grace stood at the window fully dressed in a clean calico dress, watching his prize stallion Thunder pace the far corral. Morning light caught the serious expression on her face as she studied the horse's movements with obvious interest. "Morning," Samuel said to you, nodding toward the coffee pot. "You're up with the roosters." "Old habit." Grace poured coffee into 2 tin cups, her movements efficient and precise, no wasted motion, no uncertainty about where things belonged in his kitchen. "I noticed your stallion favoring his left front leg yesterday evening when you turned him out." Samuel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, the hot liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "What slight limp? Probably a stone bruise or small puncture." Grace's voice held the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine business. "Should heal in a few days with proper care and rest." Samuel set down his cup and stared at her. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated her face, showing the calm confidence of her expression. "You diagnosed that from inside the house." Pink crept up Grace's neck like spilled wine. I notice things about animals. Always have." Samuel grabbed his hat from the peg by the door and headed outside. Grace followed, her boots clicking against the wooden porch boards in a steady rhythm that suggested someone accustomed to purposeful movement. Thunder stood in the center of the corral, his weight shifted almost imperceptibly off his left foreleg. The morning air carried the scent of hay and horse sweat, mixed with the sweetness of prairie grass, heavy with dew. Samuel climbed the split rail fence and approached the stallion. Thunder's ears flicked forward. Recognizing his owner's familiar scent and voice, Samuel ran his hands down the horse's leg, feeling for heat or swelling, then lifted the hoof. There, embedded in the soft frog, was a sharp piece of flint no bigger than a fingernail. "Well, I'll be," Samuel muttered, working the stone free with his pocket knife. Thunder immediately put full weight on the leg, shaking his head and snorting with apparent relief. Samuel patted the stallion's neck and turned back to Grace, who stood at the fence with her knuckles white where she gripped the top rail. "How in heaven's name did you spot that?" Grace's jaw tightened, and her hands trembled slightly as she released her grip on the fence. "Lucky guess, I suppose." "That wasn't luck. You know horses." Samuel climbed out of the corral, his boots hitting the packed earth with solid thuds. Real knowledge, the kind that comes from years of experience. "I've been around them some." The same evasive answer she'd given yesterday, delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who'd practiced it. "Where?" Samuel stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly in her throat. "Back east?" Grace turned away from him, her shoulders rigid with tension. "I should start breakfast." Samuel watched her walk toward the house, noting again how she moved the unconscious grace of someone trained in proper deportment, the measured steps of a lady rather than a servant. Everything about her contradicted the story she wasn't telling. "Grace?" His voice stopped her at the porch steps. "I'm not trying to pry into your business, but you just diagnosed lameness in a horse from 50 yards away through a window. That's not something most folks can do." Grace's hand gripped the porch railing so tightly her knuckles went bone white. "I observe carefully. That's all." "That kind of observation takes training. Professional training." Grace's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling in short, sharp movements. "I should check on the breakfast." "Ma." She disappeared into the house, leaving Samuel staring after her with more questions than answers. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders, but he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. After breakfast, perfectly cooked eggs, bacon fried to ideal crispness, and biscuits that would make any church lady proud, Samuel rode out to check the east pasture fencing. The work was routine, mending breaks caused by wandering cattle. But his mind kept returning to Grace's mysterious competence. When he returned at midday, sweat sticking his shirt to his back and dust coating his throat, he found Grace in his study. She sat bent over the ranch ledgers with a quill pen in her hand, her dark hair catching the afternoon light from the window. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked, removing his hat and wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Grace straightened, the pen still dripping black ink onto the blotter. "Organizing your records. They were quite disorganized." Samuel stepped around the mahogany desk to look over her shoulder. The smell of her soap lavender and something else he couldn't identify mixed with the scent of ink and old leather. His crude bookkeeping had been transformed into neat columns of figures, written in elegant copperplate script that belonged in a banker's office rather than a ranch house. Income and expenses were categorized with mathematical precision, cross-referenced and totaled with the kind of systematic approach that spoke of formal training in business practices. "You can figure sums like this?" Samuel's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Basic arithmetic." But Grace's penmanship was anything but basic. The flowing script looked like something from an expensive finishing school, each letter perfectly formed and evenly spaced. Samuel picked up one of the ledger pages, studying the precise calculations and elegant handwriting. "Where did you learn to write like this?" Grace set down the pen with careful precision, her fingers lingering on the smooth wooden handle. "School. What kind of school teaches handwriting this fancy and bookkeeping this sophisticated?" Grace's hand stilled on the leather-bound ledger. "A good one, I suppose." Samuel's forehead creased as he studied the evidence before him. The education required to produce this level of penmanship and mathematical skill didn't come cheap. It certainly didn't align with someone desperate enough to end up on an auction block. "Grace, who are you really?" Her hands began to shake, just slightly, making the pages rustle. "I'm exactly who I said I am." "Grace Miller from back east with no family living?" "Yes." But her voice carried a tremor that suggested the simple answer cost her considerable effort. "Then explain how you know about Arabian bloodlines and veterinary care and bookkeeping that would put a bank clerk to shame." Grace stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sudden movement knocked over the ink bottle, sending black liquid spreading across the desk like spilled blood. She grabbed a cloth from the washstand and began dabbing at the mess, her movements quick and agitated. "I'm sorry, I'll clean this properly." "Leave it." Samuel caught her wrist gently, feeling her pulse hammering against his fingers like a trapped bird's heartbeat. "Grace, I'm not angry. I just want to understand." She pulled free of his grip, her skin warm and soft against his work-roughened hands. "Some things are better left alone, Mr. Carter." "Not when they don't add up to sense." Grace's chin lifted in that proud angle she'd held on the auction block, defiant, dignified, completely at odds with her claimed status. Does it matter? You purchased my services. I'm providing them competently. You weren't purchased. You were rescued from a bad situation. Was I? Grace's eyes flashed with something sharp and dangerous, like sunlight off broken glass. Or did you just acquire a more genteel form of property? Samuel's stomach clenched at the bitterness in her voice, the way she spat the word property like it tasted of poison. That's not fair, and you know it. Fairness is a luxury I can't afford. Mr. Carter? Grace's voice carried a weight of experience that suggested she'd learned that lesson the hard way. The world doesn't run on fairness, it runs on power, and those who have it use it against those who don't. Grace swept out of the study, her skirts rustling against the doorframe, leaving Samuel staring at the ink-stained desk and the evidence of her mysterious education. He picked up the ledger she'd been working on, studying the absolutely correct figures and methodical organization. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, replaced by the distant clatter of pans in the kitchen. She was preparing dinner, playing the role of domestic servant with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. But servants didn't write like this. Servants didn't know thoroughbred bloodlines or advanced bookkeeping or veterinary diagnosis. Whatever Grace Miller's story was, it involved money, education, and breeding that didn't match her current circumstances. Samuel walked to the window and watched Grace hanging laundry on the line behind the house. Even in this simple domestic task, her movements held that unconscious elegance that spoke of years of training and proper comportment. She pinned his shirts to the rope with efficient motions, but her posture remained perfectly straight. Her head held high. People with Grace's obvious background didn't end up on auction blocks unless something had gone very wrong. The question that made his throat tight with unease was whether she was running from danger or toward it. That evening, Samuel found Grace sitting on the front porch, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. The kerosene flame flickered in its glass chimney, casting dancing shadows across her face as she worked. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, creating a repair that would be nearly invisible when finished. "My wife used to sew like that," Samuel said, settling into the chair beside her. The wood creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that usually brought comfort. Grace's needle paused in the fabric. "You were married? Sarah died 3 years ago. Fever took her." The words still carried a sting, even after all this time. "I'm sorry for your loss." Grace's voice held genuine sympathy, not the empty politeness most people offered. "What about you ever been married?" Grace resumed her sewing, but her stitches had grown tighter, pulled with more force than necessary. "No. Engaged." The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up on her fingertip, bright red in the lamplight. Grace pressed it to her lips, her eyes never leaving the mending in her lap. "Once," she said quietly, the word barely audible above the night sounds of crickets and distant cattle. "It didn't end well." Samuel waited, but Grace offered nothing more. She finished the shirt repair with mechanical precision and folded it neatly, setting it aside with the other mending. Her movements had grown careful, controlled, like someone walking on ice. "Grace." Samuel leaned forward in his chair, the wood creaking again. "Whatever brought you to that auction block, you don't have to carry it alone." Grace's hands stilled on the folded laundry. For a moment, her composed mask slipped, and Samuel saw something raw and painful flicker across her features. Then she stood, gathering the mending with brisk efficiency. "Good night, Mr. Carter." She disappeared into the house, leaving Samuel alone on the porch with the weight of unanswered questions. The night air carried the scent of prairie grass and distant rain, mixing with the lingering aroma of Grace's lavender soap. Samuel rose from his chair and walked to the edge of the porch. In the distance, Thunder moved easily through the corral, his lameness completely healed. Grace had been right about the stone bruise, just as she'd been right about everything else she'd observed with that unnaturally keen eye. The woman was a puzzle with too many missing pieces: professional-level education, refined mannerisms, extensive knowledge of horses and business. None of it fit with someone desperate enough to be sold at auction. Inside the house, a floorboard creaked as Grace moved through the front room. Samuel heard her pause at the window, probably watching him standing on the porch in the lamplight. Her bedroom door closed with a soft click, followed by the scrape of furniture being moved a chair positioned against the door. Perhaps. Or a trunk pushed into place. Even in his own house, Grace Miller didn't feel safe enough to sleep without barricades. Samuel stared out at the dark prairie, where coyotes called to each other across the vast emptiness. Whatever Grace was hiding, it was significant enough to land her on an auction block and desperate enough to make her accept rescue from a stranger. He'd thought he was saving someone in need of help. Now he was beginning to wonder if he'd invited something dangerous into his quiet life, something that might destroy the peaceful world he'd built on this isolated ranch. The question that kept him awake long into the night was simple but terrifying when Grace's past finally caught up with her. Would he be strong enough to protect them both from whatever was coming? Grace had been at the ranch 2 weeks when Samuel found her crouched beside the breeding charts, tacked to the barn wall, a pencil stub in her hand, and calculations covering a piece of brown wrapping paper. The morning air hung heavy with the promise of another scorching day, and sweat already beaded on Samuel's forehead despite the early hour. "Problem with the charts?" Samuel asked, stepping into the barn's cool shadow, where the smell of hay and horse sweat provided relief from the building heat outside. Grace startled like a spooked mare, dropping the pencil. It clattered against the packed dirt floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the barn's stillness. "I was just looking at the breeding schedules." Samuel picked up her paper, squinting at the numbers that covered it in neat columns. The calculations were complex breeding dates, gestation periods, projected foaling schedules that accounted for variables he'd never considered. Market timing, seasonal grass quality, even weather patterns were factored into her mathematical projections. "Where'd you learn to figure like this?" Samuel's voice carried more edge than he'd intended. Grace's cheeks flushed pink, the color spreading down her neck to disappear beneath her calico collar. "Books. I read about livestock management in agricultural journals." "What journals?" "Various ones." She reached for the paper, but Samuel held it beyond her grasp, studying the sophisticated calculations. "Grace, this isn't basic arithmetic from some farmer's almanac. You've calculated optimal breeding windows based on market demand cycles 2 years out." Samuel's throat felt dry as dust. "That's professional-level ranch management." Grace's jaw tightened, and her hands clenched into small fists at her sides. "I observe patterns in numbers. It's not so difficult." Samuel studied the calculations again, his finger tracing the neat columns. If Grace's projections were accurate, shifting the breeding schedule according to her plan could increase profits by 20% or more. The mathematical precision required for such analysis represented years of expensive education, the kind wealthy families provided their sons, not something a domestic servant would learn. "These figures are correct." "I believe so." Grace's voice came out steady, but Samuel noticed how her breathing had quickened. Samuel folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket. "We'll test them. If they work, we'll implement the whole plan." Grace's shoulders relaxed fractionally, like a person who'd been holding her breath, finally allowing herself to exhale. "You'll consider the changes if they increase profits like you think they will." "I'd be a fool not to." That afternoon, Samuel rode out to check the north pasture where his breeding stock grazed in the summer heat. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his shirt stuck to his back with sweat by the time he reached the creek that served as the property's northern boundary. When he returned to the ranch house, the smell of roasted meat and unfamiliar herbs drew him toward the kitchen like a rope pulling him home. Grace stood at the cast-iron stove, stirring something in his mother's old Dutch oven. Steam rose from the heavy pot, carrying scents that made his mouth water and his stomach growl with anticipation. "What's cooking?" Samuel removed his hat and hung it on the peg by the door, running his fingers through sweat-dampened hair. "Lamb stew." Grace lifted the wooden spoon, tasting the mixture with careful concentration. "With rosemary, thyme, and a touch of sage." Samuel's eyebrows rose. He'd been eating plain beef and beans for 3 years, seasoned with nothing more adventurous than salt and the occasional wild onion. "Where'd you get rosemary?" "I found wild herbs growing by the creek where it bends near the cottonwoods." Grace added a pinch of salt to the pot, stirring with practiced motions. The flavor combination balances the meat's richness without overpowering the natural taste. The sophisticated cooking terminology was another piece that didn't fit Grace's claimed background. Servants might know basic cooking, but this level of culinary knowledge suggested training in wealthy households, or better. "You cook like this back east." Grace's stirring motion faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "Sometimes, when the occasion called for it." "In someone else's kitchen, yes." But her voice carried a hesitation that suggested the truth was far more complicated than she was willing to admit. Samuel washed his hands at the pump outside, letting the cool water run over his wrists while he watched Grace through the kitchen window. She moved around his kitchen with the confidence of someone who understood fine cooking, adjusting seasonings and timing with the expertise of a trained chef. That evening, Samuel sat at his own table eating the finest meal he'd tasted since Sarah's death. The lamb was perfectly seasoned, tender enough to cut with a fork, accompanied by vegetables cooked to exact tenderness and fresh bread that filled the kitchen with its yeasty aroma. "This is restaurant-quality cooking, Grace." Samuel cut another piece of meat, savoring the complex flavors that spoke of expensive culinary training. Grace ate with careful precision, cutting her food into small, even pieces with the methodical etiquette of someone trained in formal table manners. "I'm pleased you enjoy it, Mr. Carter." "Who taught you to cook like this?" Grace's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Samuel saw her throat work as she swallowed carefully. "A woman I worked for had particular standards regarding meals. Must have been some particular woman. She was demanding about excellence in all things." Grace's voice grew quieter, and she focused intently on her plate. Samuel watched Grace navigate the meal with unconscious refinement, perfect posture throughout, economical movements, the natural grace of someone raised in privilege. Everything about her suggested breeding and education that went far beyond what domestic service would provide. The contradiction between her claimed background and obvious refinement was becoming impossible to ignore. Samuel found himself studying her face in the lamplight, noting the fine bone structure that spoke of generations of good breeding, the intelligent eyes that missed nothing. 3 days later, Samuel woke to the sound of retching coming from the kitchen. He found Grace bent over the wash basin, her face pale as milk and her hands shaking like autumn leaves. "Grace." Samuel stepped toward her, noting how she gripped the basin's edge to steady herself. "What's wrong?" "Stomach ailment." Grace wiped her mouth with a damp cloth, her movements careful and controlled. "I'll be fine in a moment." But by mid-afternoon, Samuel was burning with fever that made his skin feel like it was on fire. His head pounded with each heartbeat, and chills racked his body despite the summer heat that made the bedroom feel like an oven. Grace appeared at his bedside carrying a wooden tray laden with bottles, herbs, and medical supplies he'd never seen before. "Drink this." She held a tin cup to his cracked lips. The liquid tasted bitter as bark, with an underlying sweetness that masked the medicine's harsh edge. "What is it?" Samuel's voice came out as a croak. "Willow bark tea for the fever, mixed with chamomile to settle your stomach." Grace's fingers found his wrist, pressing against the pulse point with practiced precision. Her touch was cool and steady, counting his heartbeat with the clinical accuracy of someone trained in medical procedures. Samuel's fevered brain registered the professional nature of her assessment. "How do you know about taking pulse?" Grace's hand stilled on his wrist for just a moment before resuming its count. "Common knowledge for anyone who's tended sick folk. Taking pulse and measuring heartbeats isn't common knowledge. That's medical training." Grace released his arm and busied herself arranging bottles on the bedside table with methodical precision. "I've had to care for ill people before. That's all." Samuel watched her prepare another dose of medicine, measuring drops from various bottles into a clean spoon with the exact movements of someone trained in proper dosages. Her knowledge went far beyond frontier folk remedies. This was the systematic approach of formal medical education. "Grace." His voice came out rough with fever and growing suspicion. "Who taught you medicine?" Grace's hands trembled as she set down the medicine bottle, the glass clinking against the wooden table. "I learned from someone who understood healing." "A doctor? A knowledgeable person?" Grace's evasion was becoming a familiar pattern, like a dance where she always stayed one step ahead of direct answers. Samuel's fever spiked that night, sending him into delirium where reality and nightmare blended into fevered visions. He drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of Grace moving around his room with quiet efficiency. Cool cloths appeared on his forehead, liquid was coaxed between his lips, and once, in his delirium, he heard her voice speaking what sounded like Latin medical terminology. When he woke the next morning, his fever had broken like a storm passing over the prairie. Grace sat in the wooden chair beside his bed, her head tilted back in exhausted sleep. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect posture had slumped with weariness. Samuel studied her features in the morning light streaming through his bedroom window, even exhausted and worried. Grace possessed the refined bone structure of someone born to wealth and privilege. Her hands, folded in her lap, showed the faint calluses of recent ranch work, but retained the essential softness of someone unaccustomed to manual labor. Grace stirred as the morning light touched her face, opening eyes that immediately focused on Samuel with alert concern. "How do you feel like I might live after all?" Samuel struggled to sit up, testing his strength against the mattress. "You saved my life, Grace." "Hardly that." But Grace's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the acknowledgement. The fever would have broken on its own eventually, maybe, but the medicine helped considerably. Simple remedies that anyone might know. Samuel reached for the medicine bottle on his bedside table, squinting at the label written in Grace's elegant handwriting, "Willow bark extract, 15 drops every 4 hours. Reduced dose if pulse exceeds 90 beats per minute." The precise medical notation wasn't something he'd expect from someone with basic folk knowledge of healing. "Grace, where did you really learn advanced medicine like this?" Grace stood abruptly, smoothing her rumpled skirts with brisk movements. "I should prepare breakfast. You'll need nourishment to rebuild your strength." "Answer the question?" Grace's hands clenched at her sides, and her breathing quickened to short, sharp breaths. "I told you I learned from someone who understood healing." Was this someone a physician? Did you work in a medical establishment? Grace's face went white as fresh snow. I need to check on the livestock and see that they have sufficient water. She fled the room before Samuel could ask another question, leaving him staring at the collection of medicine bottles. Each one was labeled with clinical precision, the handwriting suggesting someone educated in formal medical terminology that went far beyond folk remedies. Samuel picked up another bottle and read the label carefully. Laudanum preparation. For severe pain, use sparingly. His blood ran cold. Laudanum was a dangerous drug, requiring expert knowledge to administer safely. Frontier wives didn't keep laudanum in their medicine supplies. It was prescribed by trained physicians and dispensed by qualified apothecaries. Someone with extensive medical training had taught Grace Miller advanced therapeutic techniques. The level of education required suggested instruction at expensive medical institutions or extended apprenticeship with skilled physicians. Samuel walked slowly to the window, still weak from his illness, and watched Grace moving through the corrals with practiced efficiency. She checked water levels, examined the horses for signs of illness or injury, and made notes in a small leather journal she kept in her apron pocket. Her every movement suggested someone accustomed to managing complex operations with systematic precision. A domestic servant wouldn't know Arabian bloodlines, sophisticated bookkeeping, gourmet cooking, and advanced medical procedures. Those skills represented years of privileged education and extensive practical experience in wealthy households, or something even more substantial. Grace Miller was either the most accomplished servant in Colorado Territory, or she was lying about her background in ways that ran deeper than Samuel had imagined. The question that made his chest tight with growing apprehension was simple. If she wasn't Grace Miller, domestic servant from back east, then who was she? And what had happened to force someone with her obvious breeding, education, and medical knowledge onto an auction block in a frontier town where human beings were sold like livestock? Samuel heard hoofbeats approaching the ranch at a fast clip, the rhythm urgent and purposeful. Through his bedroom window, he saw 3 riders cresting the hill that overlooked his property. Their horses were lathered with sweat as if they'd been riding hard for many miles. And the men wore the kind of expensive city clothes that didn't belong in ranch country. Grace looked up from the water trough where she'd been working, her body going rigid as carved stone. Even from the distance of the house, Samuel could see the terror that transformed her features from composed competence to naked fear. She knew these riders, and whatever they wanted with Grace Miller, it was serious enough to make a woman who'd faced an auction block with dignity look like she was staring at her own death warrant. Samuel's hands shook as he reached for his clothes, and it wasn't from lingering fever. Whatever Grace had been running from had finally caught up with her, and he had the sinking certainty that his quiet life on this isolated ranch was about to be shattered by forces far beyond his understanding or control. The drought came without warning in late July, creeping across the prairie like a slow death. Samuel woke one morning to cracked earth that rang hollow under his boots and cattle clustered around shrinking waterholes, their ribs showing through hides dulled with dust and desperation. The air shimmered with heat that made the horizon dance, and by the 3rd day without a cloud in the brazen sky, Samuel stood at his kitchen window calculating how many head he'd have to sell before they started dropping dead in his pastures. Grace found him there, staring out at the barren landscape where his green grass had turned brown and brittle. The smell of dust hung in the air like flour, coating everything with a fine layer of grit that worked its way into clothes, food, and lungs. "The cattle are suffering," she said quietly. Joining him at the window where the morning sun already beat down with the promise of another merciless day, Samuel nodded, his throat dry as the cracked earth outside. "Lost 3 head yesterday. Can't afford to lose more." His voice came out rough with worry and the dust that seemed to coat everything, including his words. Grace moved closer to the window, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used despite the water shortages. What about irrigation channels? Samuel turned to look at her, sweat already beading on his forehead though the day had barely begun. What, diverting water from the creek? Creating shallow channels to distribute it across the grazing areas? Grace spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing obvious solutions. I've read about similar systems used in California during their dry spells. Samuel's collar felt tight around his throat. You've read about irrigation engineering? Pink crept up Grace's neck, spreading beneath her calico collar like spilled wine. Agricultural periodicals sometimes discuss water management techniques. It seemed practical knowledge? What kind of servant has access to engineering journals and California agricultural reports? Grace's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles showing white against her sun-darkened skin. The curious kind who pays attention to useful information? Samuel studied her face, noting how her jaw had set in that stubborn line he was beginning to recognize. She knew far more than she was admitting again. The pattern was becoming as predictable as sunrise. How would these channels work exactly? Grace walked to the kitchen table and pulled out a piece of brown wrapping paper, smoothing it flat with movements that spoke of someone accustomed to presenting ideas to others. Her pencil moved quickly across the paper, sketching a detailed diagram of his ranch layout with proposed water channels marked in precise, confident lines. You'd dig shallow trenches following the natural slope of the land, here and here. Grace's pencil tapped specific points on her drawing with the authority of someone who'd seen such systems before. Gate systems at these locations to control water flow. The channels would carry water to grazing areas currently too far from the creek to benefit from natural irrigation. Samuel leaned over the table to examine her sketch, catching the faint scent of her hair mixed with the dust that coated everything. The engineering was sophisticated, accounting for elevation changes, natural drainage patterns, and seasonal water flow variations. The level of technical knowledge required to design such a system went far beyond anything found in casual reading. This would actually work. Samuel's finger traced one of the proposed channels, feeling the rough texture of the paper under his calloused skin. The engineering principles are sound. Grace set down the pencil with careful precision. Of course, I'm no trained engineer, but the exactness of her drawings and the professional terminology she used suggested otherwise. Samuel had seen plenty of rough sketches from men who'd built irrigation systems, and none of them had produced anything approaching Grace's level of technical detail. Samuel spent the next 2 days following Grace's irrigation plan, digging channels with his hired hands under the punishing sun. The work was backbreaking in the heat that made the air shimmer and dance. But Grace had calculated the water flow correctly down to the inch. Sweat poured down his back, soaking his shirt until it clung to his skin like a second layer. His hands blistered despite his work gloves, and his throat felt raw from breathing air thick with dust and the smell of his own perspiration. By the end of the week, green shoots were sprouting in areas that had been dust bowls, and his cattle were spreading out to graze instead of clustering desperately around the few remaining water sources. "Save the herd," Samuel told Grace as they stood watching his cattle graze contentedly in newly watered pastures. The evening air carried the sweet scent of growing grass, a smell he'd almost forgotten during the drought. "Don't know how you knew to design channels like that." Grace's shoulders tensed beneath her calico dress, and her hands worried the fabric of her apron. "Fortunate guesswork based on what I'd read." "That wasn't guesswork, Grace. That was professional engineering." Samuel's voice carried more heat than he'd intended. "Where did you really learn to design irrigation systems?" Grace turned away from the window, busying herself with dinner preparations that didn't require her immediate attention. I should start cooking. You'll be hungry after working in this heat all day. Samuel watched her move around his kitchen with fluid efficiency, but he could see the tension in her movements, the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. After dinner, another expertly prepared meal that would have been at home in Denver's finest hotel. They sat on the front porch as had become their evening custom. Grace mended clothes while Samuel whittled, the comfortable routine broken only by the distant sound of cattle settling for the night and the soft scratching of her needle through fabric. The air had finally begun to cool with the sun setting, bringing relief from the day's brutal heat. Crickets began their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called across the darkening prairie. "Grace," Samuel said finally, setting down his whittling and turning to face her in the lamplight from the kitchen window. "I need you to tell me who you really are." Grace's needle paused in the fabric, her breathing becoming shallow and quick. "I've told you the truth, Mr. Carter. You've told me stories that don't add up to anything resembling truth." Samuel kept his voice gentle but firm, the way he'd speak to a spooked horse. "No domestic servant knows veterinary medicine, advanced bookkeeping, gourmet cooking, and professional irrigation engineering." Grace set down her mending with trembling hands, the fabric sliding from her lap to the porch floor. "Some people have opportunities to learn many different things. That level of diverse education costs serious money, the kind of money that comes with family wealth and social position." Grace stood abruptly and walked to the porch railing. Gripping the wood so tightly, her knuckles went bone white in the lamplight. Her breathing quickened to short, sharp gasps that suggested she was fighting panic. "What do you want me to say, Mr. Carter?" "The truth, all of it." Grace's breathing became more ragged, her chest rising and falling rapidly as if she couldn't get enough air. "The truth is dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" "For both of us." Grace's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "You have no idea what kind of people might come looking for me." Samuel rose from his chair and joined her at the railing, close enough to see the fine tremor in her hands where they gripped the wood. "I've been patient, Grace. More patient than most men would be with someone living in their house under false pretenses. But I can't protect you if I don't know what I'm protecting you from." Grace's head turned sharply toward him, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or terror. "Protect me. You think I haven't noticed how you watch the horizon like you're expecting trouble? How you freeze every time strangers ride up to the ranch?" Samuel's voice softened, taking on the gentle tone he used with frightened animals. "You're running from something serious, or someone dangerous." Grace's shoulders sagged, and for a moment Samuel thought she might finally tell him everything. The weight of her secret seemed to press down on her like a physical burden, making her look older and more fragile in the flickering lamplight. Then she straightened, rebuilding those invisible walls he'd watched her construct every time the conversation grew too personal. "My past isn't your concern, Mr. Carter." "It is if it's going to bring violence or trouble to my ranch." Samuel's jaw tightened as he spoke the fear that had been growing in his chest. "I've got livestock to protect, a business to run. I need to know if harboring you is going to put all of that at risk." Grace flinched as if he'd struck her across the face. "You want me to leave?" "I want you to trust me enough to tell me the truth." Grace turned to face him fully, and in the lamplight from the kitchen window, Samuel could see unshed tears gathering in her eyes, making them bright and liquid. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford anymore." "Why not?" "Because the last time I trusted someone who promised to protect me, I ended up on that auction block with strangers bidding on me like I was livestock." The raw pain in Grace's voice hit Samuel like a physical blow to his chest. Samuel reached toward her instinctively, then stopped himself when she stepped backward. Grace looked like a wounded animal ready to bolt at the first wrong move, poised between fight and flight. Who betrayed you? Grace? Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the gesture quick and angry. Someone who was supposed to care about my welfare more than money or social position. Family. The closest thing I had to family after my parents died. Grace's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of lessons learned through painful experience. Samuel waited, but Grace offered nothing more. She retrieved her mending from the porch floor and returned to her chair, her movements carefully controlled, like someone walking on thin ice. Grace? Samuel settled back into his own chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Whatever happened to you before, you're safe here. I give you my word on that. No one is ever truly safe. Mr. Carter. Grace's needle moved through the fabric in quick, precise stitches. Safety is an illusion for people who haven't learned how quickly it can be stripped away. The profound cynicism in her voice suggested hard lessons learned through bitter experience. Samuel watched her mend his shirt, noting how her hands had steadied once she had a familiar task to focus on. Will you at least tell me your real name? Grace's needle stopped moving. She sat perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the fabric in her lap, as if it might contain answers to questions she couldn't voice. Grace is real enough, she said finally. But not Miller. Miller serves its purpose for now. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying Grace's profile in the dim porch light. Even in the shadows, her bone structure spoke of generations of careful breeding. The kind of refinement that came with old money and established social position. You come from wealth. It wasn't a question. Grace's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up on her fingertip, dark in the lamplight. She pressed it to her lips, her eyes never leaving her work. Money doesn't guarantee happiness. Mr. Carter, sometimes it's the source of every misery a person can imagine. But it does guarantee the kind of education you obviously received. Grace set down the mending and folded her hands in her lap with deliberate precision. Education can be a trap as easily as ignorance. How so? When it teaches you to see clearly how powerless you really are, despite all the advantages money was supposed to provide. The quiet despair in Grace's voice made Samuel's chest tighten with something that felt uncomfortably like tenderness. Whatever had driven her to that auction block had stripped away more than her security and social position. It had shattered her faith in the basic decency of the world and the people who were supposed to care for her. You're not powerless here, Grace. Aren't I? Grace's smile held no warmth, only the bitter knowledge of someone who'd learned painful truths about human nature. I exist entirely at your sufferance. Mr. Carter, one word from you. And I'm back where I started, or worse. That's not how I see our arrangement. How do you see it? Samuel considered his words carefully, aware that whatever he said next would shape the fragile trust that was slowly building between them. As a partnership between people who respect each other's contributions. Grace's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the evening air like broken glass. Partnership? You own the land, the cattle, the house where I sleep. You have the money, the legal rights, the social standing. I have nothing but the clothes on my back and skills I can't fully use without revealing who I really am. The raw honesty of her words hit Samuel harder than he'd expected. She was absolutely right legally, socially, and economically. She was completely dependent on his goodwill and protection. The realization made him uncomfortable in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. It doesn't have to stay that way forever. Doesn't it? Grace picked up her mending again, her movements sharp with controlled anger. What happens when you decide I'm too much trouble? When my past finally catches up with me and brings danger to your peaceful life? Has someone been actively searching for you? Grace's hands stilled on the fabric, and her breathing became shallow and quick. Not yet, but they will. You sound certain of that. I know the people involved, Mr. Carter. They don't forgive, and they don't forget. They have resources that most folks can't imagine, and they'll use every bit of power and influence they possess to get back what they consider their property. The certainty in Grace's voice sent ice through Samuel's veins. Who exactly is looking for you, Grace? Grace stood and gathered her mending, her movements quick and efficient. She walked toward the front door, then paused with her hand on the wooden handle. People with more money and power than you can possibly imagine. Mr. Carter, people who don't accept defeat or defiance from anyone, especially not from someone they consider their possession. She opened the door, and lamplight from inside cast her shadow long across the porch boards. You've been kinder to me than I deserved, and I'll always be grateful for that. But kindness won't be enough when they finally track me down. When who comes? Grace. Grace stepped into the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from his kitchen. My family, Mr. Carter, the people who put me on that auction block in the first place. The word hung in the night air like a threat. Samuel's blood ran cold as the implications settled in his mind like stones dropping into still water. Grace wasn't running from criminals or debtors or an abusive husband. She was running from her own family, the kind of family with enough power and resources to track down a missing member across half the continent and drag her back to whatever fate they had planned for her. The kind of family that didn't let go of what they considered their property, no matter how far it ran or how well it hid. Samuel watched Grace disappear into the house, leaving him alone on the porch with the sudden, terrifying realization that he'd fallen in love with a woman whose family had enough influence to destroy everything he'd built if they decided he was standing in their way. And according to Grace, they were coming to reclaim what they'd lost. The question that made his hands shake as he gripped the porch railing was simple but urgent. How much time did they have before Grace's powerful family tracked her down to his isolated ranch? And what would they be willing to do to take her back? The black carriage appeared on the horizon 3 days later, moving toward the ranch like a hearse carrying the dead. Samuel spotted it from the barn, where he was checking Thunder's newly healed hoof, the morning sun glinting off brass fittings and polished wood that had no business in ranch country. His stomach dropped like a stone thrown down a well. Carriages like that belonged to people with serious money, the kind who traveled in comfort across vast distances and expected the world to accommodate their presence. Samuel dropped Thunder's hoof and walked quickly toward the house, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each hurried step. Grace? No answer came from inside the house. He found her in the kitchen, standing frozen at the window with a coffee cup trembling in her hands like a leaf in a storm. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her pale as fresh milk. The smell of fear seemed to fill the room sharp, metallic, like the air before lightning strikes. Grace, who are those people? Samuel's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. The coffee cup slipped from Grace's nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor with a crash that seemed unnaturally loud. Brown liquid splashed across the boards in a spreading stain, and Grace stared at the mess as if she couldn't understand how it had happened. They found me. Her words came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat working as if she could barely force the sounds past her lips. Samuel gripped her shoulders, feeling the tremors that ran through her body like earthquake tremors. Who found you? My family. The word carried weight that made Samuel's chest feel tight, as if someone had wrapped bands of iron around his ribs. Grace's entire body had gone rigid, her breathing so shallow and quick he wondered if she might faint. She looked like someone who'd just seen her own execution warrant signed and dated. "Stay inside," Samuel said, his hands moving instinctively toward his gun belt. "Let me handle this." Grace's fingers dug into his forearm with desperate strength, her nails pressing through his shirt fabric. "You don't understand what you're facing, Mr. Carter. They'll have legal documents, official papers that make everything they do look proper and lawful." "Legal papers for what?" "To make you give me back to them, like returning stolen property to its rightful owners." Samuel's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "You're not property. You're a human being with rights under territorial law." Grace's laugh held no humor, only the hollow sound of someone who'd learned bitter truths about the world. "Rights belong to people with enough power to enforce them. I have no power. Mr. Carter, I'm legally dead or worse." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the creak of expensive leather and the jingle of quality harness metal. Through the window, Samuel watched three men climb down from the elegant vehicle with the practiced movements of people accustomed to having others accommodate their presence. The first man wore a silk top hat and tailored traveling clothes that probably cost more than most ranchers made in a good year. His face was pale and soft, unmarked by sun or wind, the features of someone who'd never missed a meal or worked with his hands. He carried himself with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The second man was younger, dressed in similar finery but with hard eyes that swept the ranch buildings with the calculating assessment of someone evaluating property. His movements suggested controlled violence, like a snake coiled to strike. The third man made Samuel's blood run cold. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the controlled precision of someone trained in professional violence. The bulge beneath his expensive coat left no doubt about his purpose here. "Private investigators," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. "And my cousin Edward." Samuel heard the hatred in her voice when she spoke the cousin's name, the way it came out like poison being spat from her mouth. "Edward. Edward Harrison Maxwell, my father's nephew and heir apparent to the family business." Grace's hands shook as she smoothed her calico dress with movements that suggested she was trying to armor herself for battle. "He's the one who arranged for me to be disposed of." "Disposed of how?" "Locked away where I couldn't interfere with family business anymore. Where I couldn't cause problems by refusing to marry the man they'd chosen for me." Samuel's throat tightened with growing anger. "What kind of problems?" "The kind that happens when a woman values her own conscience more than family profit." Grace's voice carried the flat tone of someone reciting facts that had cost her everything. A sharp knock echoed through the house. The sound authoritative and impatient, Samuel squeezed Grace's hand once, feeling how cold her skin had become despite the morning warmth. "Stay here. Don't come out unless I call for you." Samuel opened the front door to find the three men arranged on his porch, like a tribunal, preparing to deliver judgment. The older man stepped forward, removing his hat with practiced courtesy that didn't reach his calculating eyes. "Good morning. I'm Theodore Whitman, attorney representing the Harrison Maxwell family interests." His voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. "We're searching for a young woman who may have found employment at your ranch under unfortunate circumstances." Samuel kept his expression neutral, though his hand drifted closer to his gun belt. "What young woman would that be?" "Miss Grace Harrison Maxwell. She's been missing from her family for several months now." Whitman's smile was perfectly professional, like a banker discussing loan terms. "We have reason to believe she may be working here under an assumed identity." I employ a woman named Grace Miller. May we see her immediately? The younger man stepped forward, his face flushed with barely controlled impatience. We've traveled a considerable distance and have urgent family business to discuss with her. Samuel's hand moved fractionally closer to his gun. State your business with her first. The younger man's eyes flashed dangerously. I'm Edward Harrison Maxwell, the missing woman's cousin. Grace is my family's responsibility, and we're here to take her home where she belongs. Home? Samuel's voice sharpened. Or back to whatever institution you had her locked up in. Edward's face went red with sudden anger. How dare you suggest, Edward? Whitman's voice cut smoothly across his rising fury. Mr. Carter, I assure you we have Miss Harrison Maxwell's best interests at heart. She's been unwell. Her family is deeply concerned for her mental and physical welfare. Unwell in what way? She suffers from hysteria and dangerous delusions. The shock of certain family financial difficulties affected her mental stability quite severely. Whitman reached inside his coat and withdrew a folded document with official seals. We have medical certification of her condition and legal authority to ensure she receives proper therapeutic treatment. Samuel's stomach churned as he took the papers. He'd heard about medical treatment for hysterical women, locked rooms, restraints, and procedures designed to break a person's spirit along with their will to resist. I'd like to examine these documents carefully. Whitman handed over the papers with the confident air of someone whose documentation had never been questioned. Samuel scanned them quickly, his jaw tightening as he read. The medical certification described Grace as subject to violent delusions and dangerous to herself and others. The legal documents gave the Harrison Maxwell family complete authority over her person, property, and medical care. These papers describe someone violently insane, Samuel said carefully. Grace Miller is the most level-headed, competent woman I've ever encountered. She can be quite convincing when she chooses to be, Edward said with cold certainty. Grace has always been exceptionally clever at emotional manipulation. That's part of her mental illness, the ability to present herself as rational while harboring dangerous delusions. What kind of delusions? She believes our family has mistreated her, that we've locked her away unjustly for refusing marriage to a perfectly suitable gentleman. Edward's voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. Classic symptoms of her hysterical condition: paranoid fantasies about the people who care for her most. Samuel looked between the three men, noting their expensive clothes, professional demeanor, and apparent genuine concern. The attorney seemed competent and reasonable. Edward appeared sincerely worried about a disturbed family member. The enforcer stood ready to handle any trouble that might arise. If Samuel hadn't lived with Grace for weeks, hadn't seen her intelligence and rock-solid competence firsthand, he might have believed their story. A wealthy young woman, prone to hysteria and delusions, spinning elaborate tales about cruel family members to gain sympathy. It was entirely plausible. But Samuel had watched Grace diagnose horse lameness, design complex irrigation systems, and manage sophisticated bookkeeping. He'd seen her administer medical care with the skill of a trained nurse. Whatever else Grace might be, she wasn't mentally unstable. I'll need to speak with Grace before making any decisions about her future. Of course. Whitman's smile was perfectly reasonable, the expression of someone confident in the rightness of his position. We understand your caution, Mr. Carter, but I'm certain once you review the medical documentation thoroughly, you'll agree that returning her to proper therapeutic care is the only humane course of action. Samuel nodded toward the house. Wait here while I talk to her. He found Grace standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but composed. She'd heard every word of the conversation. and her expression held the grim acceptance of someone who'd known this moment would eventually come. "They have legal papers," Samuel said quietly. "I know. Papers that say you're mentally ill and dangerous to yourself and others." Grace's chin lifted in the proud gesture Samuel had come to know well, the same defiant angle she'd held on the auction block. "Do you believe what those papers say?" Samuel studied her face, the clear, intelligent eyes, the steady breathing, the controlled posture. Nothing about Grace suggested mental instability or dangerous delusions. "No, but a territorial judge might. A territorial judge will if my family pays him enough." Grace's voice carried quiet certainty based on bitter experience. "They have connections that reach into every level of government and law enforcement. Mr. Carter, they can make any story believable if they invest enough money in the right people. Then we'll fight them in court with the truth." "With what truth? You're one rancher in Colorado Territory. They're one of the most powerful shipping families in America." Grace's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "The legal system isn't designed to protect people like me from people like them." Samuel heard footsteps on the porch, impatient. Authoritative steps that suggested the Harrison Maxwell representatives were tired of waiting and prepared to take more direct action. "Grace." Samuel stepped closer to her, close enough to see the fine tremor in her hands despite her controlled facade. "Whatever they've done to you before, whatever they plan to do now, I won't let them take you without a fight." Grace's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back with fierce determination. "You can't fight them, Samuel, and I won't let you destroy everything you've built trying to protect me." "Then what do you want to do?" "I'll go with them." Grace straightened her shoulders with the resigned courage of someone accepting an inevitable fate. "It's the only way to keep you safe." Another knock echoed through the house, more demanding this time. Edward's voice called out with growing impatience. "Mr. Carter, we really must insist on seeing Grace immediately. We have urgent family matters to discuss." Grace walked toward the front door with steady steps, her spine straight and her head held high. Samuel watched her transform before his eyes, the competent ranch woman disappearing, replaced by someone who moved with the careful dignity of someone prepared for sacrifice. "Like damnation, you will." Samuel caught her arm gently. "Nobody's taking you anywhere against your will. It's not against my will if it protects you from their retaliation. I don't need protection from lawyers and private investigators." Grace turned to face him, and Samuel saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before, complete despair mixed with fierce protectiveness. "Yes, you do. From them, from me, from everything I represent." She pulled free of his grip and reached for the door handle. Samuel watched her prepare to sacrifice herself to keep him safe, to surrender her hard-won freedom, to protect his peaceful life from the storm her presence had brought to his doorstep. Grace opened the door and stepped onto the porch, and Samuel saw her transform once more as she faced the three men who'd come to take her back to whatever hell they called treatment. "Hello, Edward?" Grace's voice was steady, betraying none of the fear Samuel knew she was fighting. "I see you finally found me." Edward's face lit up with what appeared to be genuine relief and familial affection. "Grace, thank heaven we've located you at last. Father's been beside himself with worry since you disappeared from the sanitarium." "Has he truly?" "Of course he has. When you vanished from Dr. Morrison's facility, we feared the very worst." Edward stepped toward her with arms outstretched, as if to embrace a beloved relative. "Come now, let's get you home where you belong, where people who love you can provide proper care." Grace stepped backward until she bumped against Samuel's chest. The contact seemed to give her strength, and her voice grew firmer. I'm not going anywhere. Edward? Edward's expression hardened, the mask of familial concern slipping slightly. Grace, you're not thinking clearly. That's part of your condition. Remember, the doctors explained how the illness affects your judgment. What illness would that be? Now, Grace? Whitman interrupted smoothly, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone addressing a confused child. We know you've been through a difficult period, but your family loves you and wants only what's best for your recovery. Grace's body trembled against Samuel's chest, and he could feel her struggling to maintain her composure in the face of their calculated manipulation. Mr. Carter, Whitman continued, as you can see, Miss Harrison Maxwell is clearly in distress. The longer we delay her return to proper medical supervision, the more agitated and confused she becomes. Samuel looked at Grace's pale face, at the way her hands shook despite her efforts to appear calm and rational. To an outside observer, she did appear unstable, frightened, trembling, speaking defiantly to family members who'd traveled across the country to help her. It was the perfect trap. Her family's very presence created the symptoms they claimed to be treating, making their case for her while simultaneously destroying her credibility. Grace, Samuel said quietly, tell me the complete truth, right now, all of it. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage like someone preparing to jump off a cliff. Then she opened them and looked directly at the three men who'd come to drag her back to captivity. My name is Grace Elizabeth Harrison Maxwell. My father owns Harrison Maxwell Shipping, one of the largest freight and passenger companies in America. Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth gave her power. When I refused to marry the European count my family had chosen for me, a man who made it clear he intended to use me to pay his gambling debts in particularly degrading ways, they had me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a private asylum. Edward's face twisted with what looked like genuine anguish. You see the delusions again. Grace, no one tried to force you into any marriage. You became hysterical when Father suggested you might benefit from spending time in European society. The doctor said exactly what you paid them to say. Grace's voice cut across his protests like a blade. Just like they'll say whatever you pay them to say when you drag me back to that nightmare you call therapeutic treatment? The third man, the enforcer, stepped forward slightly, his hand moving toward his coat. Samuel's gun cleared its holster before the man could complete the motion. Easy there, friend, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd used weapons in deadly earnest before. Whitman raised his hands in a calming gesture, his professional demeanor never wavering. Gentlemen, please, there's no need for violence here. Mr. Carter, surely you can see that Miss Harrison Maxwell's accusations are exactly the kind of paranoid fantasies described in her medical files. Samuel kept his weapon trained on the enforcer while his mind raced through possibilities. Grace's story sounded incredible: wealthy heiress, forced marriage, corrupt doctors, private asylums. But every detail matched what he'd observed about her education, her mannerisms, her obvious breeding and sophisticated knowledge. More importantly, he'd seen the raw terror in her eyes when she spotted their carriage approaching. That wasn't the confusion of mental illness. It was the fear of someone who'd experienced real trauma at the hands of people who should have protected her. Mr. Carter, Edward said, his voice taking on a harder edge as his patience ran thin. You're interfering with a lawful family matter. Grace is mentally ill and legally incompetent to make decisions about her own welfare. If you continue to harbor her against our lawful authority, we'll have no choice but to involve territorial law enforcement. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his gun steady. Let them come, They will rule in our favor, Whitman said with supreme confidence. We have extensive documentation, medical testimony from respected physicians, and financial resources to ensure justice is properly served. You have nothing but the word of a mentally unstable woman who's clearly manipulated your emotions for her own confused purposes. Samuel looked at Grace, who stood perfectly still beside him. Her face showed no expression, but he could feel the tension radiating from her body like heat from a forge fire. Grace, he said quietly, are they telling the truth? Are you Grace Harrison Maxwell, heir to a shipping fortune? Grace's shoulders sagged with the weight of finally admitting the deception she'd carried for months. Yes. And everything you told me about your past was a lie. Grace's voice came out as a whisper filled with shame and regret. Yes. Samuel felt the betrayal hit him like a physical blow to his chest. Everything, her name, her background, her reasons for being on that auction block had been an elaborate deception designed to hide her true identity. Edward smiled triumphantly, sensing victory. You see, Mr. Carter Grace is exceptionally skilled at creating convincing fantasies. It's part of her mental illness, the compulsive need to reinvent herself and manipulate others with fictional stories. Samuel stared at Grace, whose face had gone completely blank and expressionless. She looked like someone who'd given up fighting, who'd accepted whatever fate others chose to impose on her. The woman he'd fallen in love with, Grace Miller. Competent ranch worker had never existed. She'd been a performance, a character Grace had created to hide her true identity and tragic circumstances. Her family had legal authority, medical documentation, and unlimited resources. They could take Grace back to whatever private hell they'd prepared for her. And there wasn't a single thing a Colorado rancher could do to stop them legally. Take her, Samuel said, his voice rough with anger and hurt. Take her and get off my property. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and something that looked like heartbreak. Samuel. Take her and go. Samuel holstered his gun and turned away, unable to look at the devastation in her face. But as Grace walked toward the carriage with mechanical steps, her shoulders straight despite her defeat, Samuel realized he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Because whatever else Grace Harrison Maxwell might be, whatever lies she'd told him about her identity, the terror in her eyes when she looked at these men was absolutely, devastatingly real. And he just handed her over to the people who'd put that terror there in the first place, the people who'd already destroyed her once and were preparing to do it again. Samuel watched the black carriage disappear over the hill, dust swirling in its wake like smoke from a funeral pyre. His hands shook as he holstered his gun, the metal cold and unfamiliar against his sweating palm. The taste of shame filled his mouth like copper pennies. Grace was gone. Grace Harrison Maxwell, not Miller. Never Miller was gone back to whatever private hell her family called proper treatment. Samuel walked into his empty house and stopped in the kitchen doorway. The shattered coffee cup still lay scattered across the floor, brown stains spreading between the boards like old blood. He knelt on the rough wood, feeling splinters bite through his trouser knees, and began picking up the jagged pieces, each shard cut into his fingers, leaving thin lines of red on his skin. The physical pain felt cleaner than the hollow ache in his chest where something had been torn away and left bleeding. Everything Grace had touched in this house was tainted now with deception. The perfectly organized ledgers on his desk. Written in her elegant hand, lies. The gourmet meals that had filled his kitchen with warmth and wonderful smells, performances by someone playing a role. The gentle hands that had nursed him through fever, the calculated kindness of a woman, hiding her true identity behind a servant's mask. Samuel swept the broken porcelain into his palm, feeling fresh cuts sting his already bloody fingers. Glass fragments sparkled in the morning light streaming through the window where Grace had stood watching for danger every day since she'd arrived. 3 days passed in a haze of routine that felt like sleepwalking. Samuel fed cattle that seemed to mock him with their contentment, mended fences that felt pointless without anyone to protect, checked water levels and irrigation channels that Grace had designed with her mysterious engineering knowledge. Every task reminded him of her presence, her competent hands working beside his, her quiet observations that had saved his herd during the drought, her unconscious grace that had made his rough house feel like a home. On the 4th day, Samuel found her carpet bag in the spare room where she'd slept. She'd left it behind in her rush to surrender to her family's authority. Samuel's hands trembled as he opened the worn leather, expecting to find more evidence of her elaborate deception. Instead, he found a leather journal filled with Grace's elegant handwriting. The pages contained detailed observations about ranch life, careful sketches of the landscape, and precise notations about cattle breeding that showed genuine love for the work. But it was the final entry that made Samuel's throat close like a fist was squeezing it. Mr. Carter believes I am someone I am not. And perhaps that is merciful for both of us. The woman I was before Grace Harrison Maxwell was weak, controlled, voiceless as a doll in a shop window. Here, as Grace Miller, I have discovered I can be useful, competent, valued for what I contribute rather than what I inherit. Through accident of birth. For the first time in my life, I understand what it means to earn respect rather than demand it through birthright and family position. When they come for me, and they will come, as surely as winter follows autumn, I hope Mr. Carter remembers Grace Miller with some kindness and forgets Grace Harrison Maxwell ever existed in his peaceful world. Samuel read the words again, his vision blurring until he had to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. The ink had smeared in places, as if tears had fallen on the page while Grace was writing. She hadn't been performing a role for his benefit, she'd been discovering who she really was when stripped of wealth and status and family expectations. Grace Miller hadn't been a lie. Grace Miller had been the person Grace Harrison Maxwell was trying to become. And he'd thrown her back to the wolves because his pride couldn't handle being deceived about her name and background. Samuel's boots pounded against the floor as he paced his empty house, shame burning in his chest like swallowed fire. He'd condemned an innocent woman to whatever hellish treatment awaited her because she'd lied about her identity, while running for her life from family members who considered her their property. The woman who'd saved his cattle, organized his books, and nursed him through illness was gone. In her place was the bitter knowledge that he'd failed someone who'd needed his protection, someone who'd trusted him enough to let down her guard and show him her real self. Samuel saddled his horse and rode hard toward Millbrook, the wind cutting across his face like a blade. At the telegraph office, he sent 3 urgent wires, one to the territorial marshal, one to a lawyer friend in Denver, and one to the federal courthouse inquiring about the legal procedures for challenging involuntary asylum commitments. The responses came back within 2 days, each one confirming his worst fears. The Harrison Maxwell family had extensive legal documentation supporting Grace's involuntary commitment. Their wealth and political connections had purchased medical testimonies, legal precedents, and judicial cooperation that made challenging their authority nearly impossible through normal legal channels. Grace was property in the eyes of the law, no different from livestock or furniture. Her family owned her as completely as Samuel owned his cattle. with full legal authority to do whatever they deemed necessary for her supposed welfare. On the 6th day, Samuel sat on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky red as blood, trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Grace had lied to him, manipulated him, made him care for someone who didn't exist. She was better off with her own people, receiving proper medical care for whatever condition had led to her family's intervention. But even as he thought the words, Samuel knew he was lying to himself with the desperate creativity of a coward trying to justify betrayal. He'd seen the terror in Grace's eyes when she looked at her cousin Edward. He'd felt her body trembling against his as she faced the men who'd come to drag her back to captivity. That hadn't been the confusion of mental illness. It was the fear of someone who knew exactly what fresh horrors awaited her in the place they called treatment. Samuel was still sitting on his porch, drowning in shame and self-loathing, when he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A single rider, pushing his horse hard across the prairie in the fading light. As the figure drew closer, Samuel recognized Pete Morrison, the blacksmith from Millbrook. Pete pulled his lathered horse to a stop in front of the porch, the animal's sides heaving with exhaustion. "Samuel, you need to hear what I learned about your fancy visitors." Samuel's stomach clenched like a fist. "What about them?" Pete dismounted on unsteady legs, his face grim in the dying light. "That black carriage stopped at the hotel overnight before heading east. I was shoeing their horses the next morning when I overheard the men talking while they thought nobody was listening. What did they say? They weren't taking that girl to any loving family reunion. Samuel?" Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. "They were transporting her to some private asylum back east where folks go in, but don't come out." Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. "I know. They showed me medical papers stating she needed treatment." "Did they show you the bruises on her arms, where somebody had been gripping her too hard?" Samuel's hands gripped the porch railing so tight the wood creaked under the pressure. "What bruises?" Mary Henderson was sweeping the hotel porch when they loaded the girl into that carriage. She got a good look at her arms when the wind blew her sleeves up. Pete's weathered face twisted with disgust. Said they were black and blue from wrist to elbow, like someone had been holding her down hard enough to leave finger marks. Samuel's vision blurred with rage so pure it felt like looking into the sun. They hurt her. That ain't the worst part." Pete shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the dirt. "Mary said she heard crying from inside that carriage as it rolled out of town. Not hysterical sobbing like you'd expect from someone truly mad, just quiet, hopeless weeping. The kind that comes from someone who's given up fighting and accepted whatever hell they're being carried toward." Samuel stood so abruptly, his chair crashed backward against the porch wall. The sound echoed across the prairie like a gunshot, startling Pete's horse into nervous sidesteps. "How long ago did they leave Millbrook?" 3 days, maybe 4. But Samuel... Pete caught his arm as Samuel headed for the door. "What are you planning to do? You can't fight that kind of money and legal authority. They'll crush you like a bug." Samuel pulled free of Pete's grip, his jaw set with determination that felt like iron. "Getting her back. She lied to you, Samuel. Made you look like a fool in front of the whole territory." Samuel turned to face Pete, and something in his expression made the blacksmith step backward. "Grace Miller never lied to me about anything that mattered. Grace Miller cooked my meals, saved my cattle with those irrigation channels, and nursed me through fever without asking for anything in return except the chance to earn honest wages." That was Grace Harrison Maxwell pretending to be someone else entirely. Was it? Samuel's voice carried conviction born from reading her journal, from understanding what her time at his ranch had really meant. Or was it Grace Harrison Maxwell finally getting to be who she really was underneath all that family wealth and social position? Pete shook his head with the exasperation of someone trying to talk sense to a madman. Either way, she's gone now. Chasing after her will only get you killed or locked up right alongside her. Samuel walked into his house and emerged carrying his rifle, ammunition, and a travel pack loaded with supplies for a long journey. Then that's a risk I'll have to take. Samuel, be reasonable about this. What can one rancher possibly do against an entire powerful family with unlimited resources? Samuel swung up into his saddle, his eyes hard as flint in the gathering darkness. I can make them pay for every bruise on her arms. I can make them regret the day they decided to treat a human being like livestock to be bought and sold. And after that, even if you somehow manage to get her away from them, where will you go? They'll have federal marshals and private investigators hunting both of you across the entire country. Samuel gathered his reins, his face set with grim purpose. There are places out here where money and legal papers don't reach, Pete. Places where a man and woman can disappear and build a new life if they're willing to work hard and ask no questions about each other's past. You're talking about throwing away everything you've built here. Samuel looked back at his ranch, the solid buildings he'd constructed with his own hands, the thriving cattle he'd bred and raised, the irrigated land that represented years of back-breaking labor. It was everything he'd accomplished, everything he'd dreamed of achieving when he'd first claimed this piece of prairie. But without Grace, it was just property. Just buildings and animals and dirt that would crumble and fade while the memory of her laughter echoed through his empty house for the rest of his life. What good is building something if you're too much of a coward to fight for what really matters? Pete stepped back as Samuel wheeled his horse toward the eastern road. Samuel, wait. At least tell me you have some kind of plan beyond riding off into the night like some knight in a fairy tale. Samuel's smile was cold and deadly as winter wind. I have a plan. Find them, take her back, and kill anyone who tries to stop me. That's not a plan. Samuel, that's suicide by legal authority. Samuel spurred his horse into a gallop, Pete's shouted warnings fading behind him as he rode toward the eastern horizon, where Grace was being carried toward a fate worse than death. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, Grace was trapped with the men who'd already brutalized her, being transported to an asylum where she would disappear forever. But as Samuel pushed his horse harder across the moonlit prairie, one terrible question gnawed at him like a physical pain. What if Grace didn't want to be rescued anymore? What if her family had convinced her that her time at his ranch had been a delusion? That her feelings for him had been symptoms of mental illness? What if the woman he was riding to save had already accepted their version of reality, that she was sick, that she needed their treatment, that Samuel Carter had been nothing more than a temporary captor who'd taken advantage of her confused state? What if he was about to risk everything to rescue someone who no longer believed she needed rescuing? The question haunted Samuel as he rode through the night, because deep in his heart, he knew the answer might destroy him more completely than losing Grace to her family's legal authority ever could. Samuel rode through the night with stars wheeling overhead like distant campfires, his horse's hooves pounding a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The animals' breathing grew labored as they pushed eastward, following wagon ruts that led deeper into territory Samuel had never seen. By dawn, his mount stumbled with exhaustion, lather coating its neck and flanks. Samuel's own throat felt raw from breathing dust, and his back ached from hours in the saddle. But stopping meant losing precious time while Grace was carried farther from any hope of rescue. At a crossroads settlement called Cedar Falls, Samuel found the livery stable owner watering his stock at wooden troughs that steamed in the morning air. "Black carriage come through here recently?" Samuel asked, sliding down from his saddle with legs that shook from fatigue and too many hours gripping his horse's sides. Yesterday about midday. Fancy rig with city folks in expensive clothes. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in Samuel's dust-covered appearance and the desperate edge in his voice. You chasing trouble or running from it? Trying to prevent it from getting worse? Samuel traded his exhausted horse for a fresh sorrel gelding, paying with most of the cash from his vest pocket. The coins felt heavy in his palm, representing months of careful saving that disappeared in moments for the chance to close the distance between himself and Grace's captors. The trail led through broken country where red rocks jutted from rolling hills, and narrow valleys forced carriages to move slowly around obstacles. Samuel pushed his fresh mount hard, knowing he was gaining ground with every mile. The sun climbed higher, beating down until sweat soaked his shirt and his hat brim dripped moisture onto his horse's neck. By mid-afternoon, Samuel spotted dust rising from a depression ahead, the telltale cloud of a heavy vehicle moving through dry country. He crested a hill and saw the black carriage stopped beside a creek. The horses drinking, while the men stretched their legs in whatever shade they could find. Grace sat motionless in the carriage, her hands folded in her lap like a woman attending a funeral service. Even from a distance, Samuel could see how her shoulders curved inward, how her head tilted down in the defeated posture of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. Samuel dismounted and worked his way closer through scrub brush and scattered boulders, his rifle held low to avoid catching sunlight on the barrel. 50 yards from the carriage, voices carried clearly in the still air. "She's been quiet since we left Millbrook," Attorney Whitman was saying to Edward as they shared water from a canteen, much more manageable than during her previous episodes. "The medications Dr. Morrison prescribed help considerably," Edward replied, wiping sweat from his face with a silk handkerchief. "They keep her docile during transport without affecting her too severely." Samuel's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. They drugged Grace to keep her compliant during the journey, treating her like livestock being shipped to market. The woman sitting so still in that carriage wasn't calm, she was chemically sedated into submission. "How much farther to the asylum?" Edward asked, his voice carrying the impatient tone of someone anxious to complete an unpleasant task. 2 more days of steady travel. Dr. Morrison is expecting our arrival and has prepared the necessary accommodations. Whitman's voice held the satisfaction of a professional completing a successful assignment. "He assures me the new treatment methods are quite effective at achieving permanent results." "Excellent. Father wants this matter resolved once and for all." The casual way they discussed Grace's permanent disposal made Samuel's trigger finger itch with barely controlled violence. These weren't concerned family members, they were executioners discussing the most efficient method of elimination. Samuel crept closer, positioning himself behind a boulder 30 yards from the carriage where afternoon shadows provided cover. Grace sat with her back partially turned toward him, her dark hair pinned severely away from her face. Her traveling dress was wrinkled and stained from the journey, but her posture remained artificially perfect, the rigid straightness of someone fighting sedation with pure will. "Time to continue," Whitman called, consulting his gold pocket watch. "We'll make Elkhorn Station by evening if we maintain good pace." The enforcer Collins helped Grace down from the carriage with movements that seemed gentle, but carried the underlying threat of violence if she resisted. Grace moved like someone walking underwater, each step careful and deliberate. When Collins gripped her arm to steady her, Samuel saw her flinch, but she didn't pull away. That small flinch told Samuel everything he needed to know about what this journey had already cost her. Samuel waited until the carriage started moving again, then paralleled their route through the hills, staying close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid detection. He needed the right moment somewhere isolated, where he could act without endangering Grace in potential crossfire. The opportunity came as they descended into Willow Canyon, where the road narrowed between steep rocky walls and the carriage was forced to slow for fallen stones and tight turns. Samuel spurred his horse down a game trail, circling ahead to block their exit where the canyon widened. He positioned himself at the canyon mouth where the road emerged into open country, his rifle across his saddle horn and his heart hammering against his ribs. When the carriage rounded the final bend, Samuel sat waiting like judgment incarnate. "That's far enough," Samuel called to Howie, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The driver hauled on the reins, bringing the carriage to a lurching stop that made the horses snort and stamp nervously. Collins had his gun half drawn before recognition dawned in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," Whitman said smoothly, his professional composure intact despite the unexpected confrontation. "This is quite a surprise. What brings you so far from your ranch? Came to collect something that was taken from me?" Edward leaned out of the carriage, his face flushing red with indignation. "We've already settled this matter legally. Grace is our family's responsibility, and we're transporting her to proper medical care." "Legal don't make it right. The law disagrees with your assessment." Whitman gestured toward Collins, who now had his weapon fully drawn and aimed at Samuel's chest. "I strongly suggest you return to your ranch before this situation becomes unpleasant for everyone involved." Samuel kept his rifle trained on Collins while addressing Grace directly. "Grace, look at me." Grace's head turned slowly, her movements thick with whatever drugs they'd forced into her system. When her eyes met Samuel's across the dusty space between them, he saw something that made his chest tighten with protective fury. Relief so profound, it was almost anguish. "You came for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of horses breathing and leather creaking. "Said I'd protect you." Meant every word. Edward's voice cracked like a whip across the canyon air. "Grace, you're not thinking clearly. The medication makes you confused and susceptible to outside influence. Mr. Carter is a stranger who took advantage of your illness for his own purposes." "No." Grace's voice was soft but steady, carrying more strength than Samuel had dared hope for. "Samuel never took anything from me that I didn't freely give. He was the first person who ever valued me for what I could contribute, rather than what I could inherit." "Contribute." Edward's laugh was sharp with bitter amusement. "Grace, you're heir to one of America's largest shipping enterprises. You don't need to scrub floors and tend cattle like some common servant. I needed to matter for something other than my bank account and family connections." Grace straightened in the carriage seat, fighting the drug's effects as determination overrode chemical suppression. "At Samuel's ranch, I mattered because I was useful, competent, valued for my work rather than my birthright." "More delusions," Whitman said with practiced authority. "Classic symptoms of her deteriorating mental condition." "My condition?" Grace's voice grew stronger as adrenaline burned away the sedation clouding her thoughts. "My condition is that I was born into a family that sees women as property to be managed, traded, and disposed of when they become inconvenient." Samuel saw Collins shifting his position, trying to get a cleaner shot without risking harm to the carriage's occupants. "Collins, you move that gun another inch toward me and I'll put a bullet through your shooting hand." Collins froze, his weapon wavering between Samuel and the ground. "Mr. Carter," Whitman said with forced reasonableness, "you're interfering with the lawful transport of a mentally ill woman who requires professional medical intervention. Miss Harrison Maxwell needs specialized treatment that only Dr. Morrison's facility can provide. She needs freedom from people who think they own her." "Look at her condition," Edward insisted desperately. "Drugged, agitated, making wild accusations against her own family. Does this seem like rational behavior from a woman of her breeding and education?" Samuel studied Grace's face carefully, even sedated and exhausted from her ordeal. Her eyes held the same intelligence he'd seen when she diagnosed Thunder's lameness, the same competence she'd shown designing irrigation systems that saved his cattle. Sounds like someone who figured out what she was really worth when nobody was telling her what to think or who to marry. Grace climbed down from the carriage with movements that grew steadier as her body metabolized whatever drugs they'd given her. "Samuel, they're taking me to Morrison Asylum in Pennsylvania. It's not a hospital. It's a private prison where inconvenient family members disappear permanently." "More paranoid fantasies?" Edward said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dr. Morrison operates one of the finest therapeutic facilities in the country. Dr. Morrison operates a warehouse for wealthy families who want relatives eliminated without the scandal of outright murder," Grace shot back, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Women go into Morrison's asylum and never come out. Their families control their inheritance while they rot in locked cells, drugged into compliance until they forget their own names." Samuel's finger tightened on his rifle trigger as the full horror of Grace's situation became clear. "That true? Whitman?" Miss Harrison Maxwell's imagination has always been dramatically overactive. Whitman replied with professional smoothness that didn't quite hide his discomfort. "Answer the question directly." Whitman's composed facade cracked slightly under Samuel's steady gaze. "Dr. Morrison's facility specializes in long-term residential care for patients with chronic mental conditions." "How long-term?" "As long as necessary for complete therapeutic resolution." Samuel understood the euphemism perfectly. Grace would disappear into that asylum and never emerge. Her family would control her vast inheritance while she slowly died in captivity, drugged into submission until she forgot she'd ever been anything more than a mad woman locked away for her own good. "Grace," Samuel said quietly, his voice cutting through the canyon air like a blade. "Do you want to come home with me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back with fierce determination. "It's not that simple, Samuel." "They have legal authority, financial resources, political connections that reach every level of government." "I'm not asking what's legal or practical or safe. I'm asking what you want." Grace looked between Samuel and her cousin Edward, between the man who'd given her honest work and dignity and the family that had treated her like a problem to be permanently solved. "I want to go home," she said with quiet certainty. "To the ranch, to the place where I learned who I really am, when I'm allowed to be myself." Edward's face twisted with rage, and something that might have been genuine bewilderment. "You're choosing that primitive existence over everything our family can offer, over wealth, position, security, social prominence. I'm choosing dignity over comfort, respect over luxury, the chance to be valued for what I do rather than what I inherit through accident of birth." Grace's voice carried the ring of absolute conviction. "I'm choosing love freely given over marriage, forced through economic necessity." "Collins," Edward snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Take her. Use whatever force is necessary." Collins raised his gun toward Samuel, but Grace stepped directly between them before he could take aim. "No. Miss, please move aside. I have orders to—" "Your orders were to transport a mentally ill woman to medical treatment?" Grace faced Collins directly, her chin lifted with the natural authority of someone born to command. "I'm standing here making completely rational decisions about my own life and future. Does that sound mentally ill to you?" Collins hesitated, his gun wavering as doubt crept into his eyes. Samuel could see the man struggling with the contradiction between his instructions and the evidence before him. Grace poised, articulate, clearly in full control of her mental faculties. She's obviously recovered from whatever condition she had, Samuel said calmly. Seems to me her family's treatment was more successful than they expected. Temporary lucidity, Whitman said quickly. Common in cases of hysteria and delusional behavior, she'll relapse without proper medical supervision. Will I? Grace's question was directed at Collins, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with his role as enforcer. Do I seem hysterical or delusional to you right now? Collins lowered his weapon slightly. His weathered face creased with uncertainty. No, miss. You seem perfectly sensible to me. Then why are you holding me against my clearly stated will? Collins looked between Grace and Edward, his confusion evident. Your family says you need help, miss. My family says many things to justify their actions, but I'm telling you directly that I don't want their help. Grace stepped closer to Collins, her voice gentle but absolutely firm. I'm asking you, as one human being to another, to let me choose my own path in life. Samuel watched Collins struggle with the moral weight of his situation. The man had been hired to transport a raving madwoman to medical treatment, but Grace stood before him lucid, dignified, and clearly capable of making rational decisions about her own welfare. Collins, Edward's voice cracked like a whip across the canyon. You're paid to follow orders, not make moral judgments about family matters. But she don't seem crazy to me, Collins said slowly, his gun drooping toward the ground. That's not your determination to make, Whitman snapped, his professional composure finally fraying under the pressure. We have medical documentation from qualified physicians, written by doctors who were paid to reach predetermined conclusions. Grace interrupted. Men who never examined me but signed papers declaring me insane because my family needed legal justification for my imprisonment. Collins stared at Grace, then at Edward's flushed, angry face, then back at Grace's calm, reasonable demeanor. Samuel could see the exact moment when the enforcer made his decision. Collins holstered his weapon and stepped back from Grace with visible relief. I ain't in the business of kidnapping sane women for money. Edward's face went purple with apoplectic rage. You're abandoning your contractual obligations. I'm following my conscience instead of your gold. Collins looked at Grace with something approaching respect. Miss, you want to go with these folks. That's your right to choose. You want to go with the rancher. That's also your right. But I ain't forcing you either direction. Grace walked to Samuel's horse and looked up at him with eyes that held hope for the first time since her family had arrived at the ranch. May I ride behind you? Samuel holstered his rifle and extended his hand downward. Hold on tight. We've got a long ride ahead. As Grace settled behind him on the horse, her arms circling his waist with desperate strength, Samuel felt her trembling not with fear now, but with relief so profound it shook her entire frame. This isn't over, Edward snarled from the carriage. We'll have federal marshals hunting you both. You're harboring a legally incompetent woman against her family's lawful authority. Maybe so, Samuel said, gathering his reins. But Grace made her choice in front of a witness. Collins here saw her acting completely rational when she chose to leave with me. Collins nodded slowly. That's exactly how I'll testify if this matter comes before a judge. Samuel spurred his horse toward the canyon mouth, Grace's arms tight around his waist, and her cheek pressed against his back. Behind them, he heard Edward cursing, and Whitman trying to salvage their failed mission with threats of legal retaliation. But as they rode toward the open prairie beyond the canyon, one terrible realization grew in Samuel's mind like a tumor. This wasn't victory. It was just the opening battle of a war that could destroy them both. The Harrison Maxwell family wouldn't accept defeat quietly. They had unlimited financial resources, political connections that reached the highest levels of government, and the ruthless determination of people who'd never been denied anything they wanted. Samuel had rescued Grace from immediate danger, but he'd also made enemies who wouldn't rest until they reclaimed what they considered their property under law. And Grace was still, technically and legally, their property regardless of her personal wishes or mental competence. The question that gnawed at Samuel as they rode through the darkening canyon was brutally simple. How long could one Colorado rancher and a woman the courts considered insane stay ahead of a family with unlimited resources and connections that reached into every corner of American legal and political power? More frighteningly, what would the Harrison Maxwell family be willing to do to recover their escaped property, and what would they do to the man who'd helped her escape as they emerged from Willow Canyon onto the open prairie? Samuel heard the distant sound of multiple riders approaching fast across the grassland. Too many horses for coincidence, moving with the purposeful rhythm of men on urgent business. Grace's arms tightened around his waist as she heard them too. "Samuel," she whispered against his shoulder, "I think we're about to find out exactly how far my family is willing to go to take me back." Samuel's ranch house appeared in the distance as the sun touched the western mountains, its windows glowing golden in the late afternoon light like beacon fires, welcoming them home. Grace's arms had loosened around his waist during the long ride, but she still held tight enough that Samuel could feel each breath she took against his back. The sound of distant hoofbeats had faded hours ago. Either they'd lost their pursuers in the broken country near Willow Canyon, or the riders had turned back to regroup with reinforcements. Either way, Samuel wasn't fool enough to think they were safe. "We're home," Samuel said quietly, the words carrying more weight than a simple statement of arrival. Grace straightened behind him, her hands sliding from his ribs to rest lightly on his shoulders. "It looks exactly the same as when I left. Been less than a week. Feels like years." Grace's voice held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd traveled through hell and emerged, changed. "Everything looks smaller somehow, more precious." Samuel dismounted and helped Grace down from the horse, noting how her legs trembled when her feet touched familiar ground. The drugs her family had forced into her system were still working their way out of her body, leaving her unsteady but clear-minded. "Thank you," Grace said simply, her voice hoarse from the long journey and whatever she'd endured in that carriage. Samuel led his exhausted horse toward the barn, Grace walking beside him with careful steps that grew steadier with each yard of home ground beneath her feet. The familiar routine of unsaddling, brushing, and feeding felt different with her presence more complete somehow, like a half-remembered song finally played in its entirety. "Samuel." Grace's fingers traced the wooden channels of the irrigation system she'd designed, now carrying life-giving water to green pastures where his cattle grazed in evening contentment. "They're still working. Saved the whole herd during the drought, just like you calculated they would." Grace knelt beside one of the channels, letting the clear water run through her fingers while she studied the healthy grass growing in previously barren areas. "I wasn't entirely certain the mathematics were correct when I drew up those plans. They were perfect. Every measurement, every angle, every flow calculation." Samuel watched her examine her handiwork with the critical eye of someone who understood engineering principles. "You saved everything I'd built here." Grace stood slowly, brushing dust from her traveling dress, the same wrinkled, stained garment she'd been wearing when her family took her from this place. But she moved in it now with natural ease, like someone who belonged in working clothes rather than silk and jewels. "What happens now?" "Samuel," Grace's question carried the weight of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary, that peace could be shattered without warning. "Now we figure out how to build a life together that nobody can take away from us." They walked to the front porch and settled into the wooden chairs where they'd spent so many evenings before her family's arrival. Grace folded her hands in her lap with automatic precision, but Samuel could see the fine tremor in her fingers that suggested the ordeal wasn't entirely behind her. "I need to tell you everything," Grace said quietly. "The complete truth, without evasion or omission." Samuel settled back in his chair, the familiar wood creaking under his weight. "I'm listening." Grace took a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from the evening air scented with prairie grass and the distant smell of his cattle. "My father is Harrison Maxwell, owner of Harrison Maxwell Shipping Company. When I was 20 years old, he arranged my engagement to Count Alessandro Visconti, a minor Italian nobleman with expensive tastes and crushing gambling debts." Samuel's hands clenched into fists as Grace's story unfolded the cruel count who'd made it clear that Grace would help settle his debts through degrading arrangements with his creditors. Her refusal to proceed with the marriage, her family's response to her defiance. "When I refused the engagement publicly at a dinner party attended by New York's social elite, my father had me declared mentally unstable and committed to a private asylum." Grace's voice remained steady, but Samuel could see the cost of reliving those memories in the tight lines around her eyes. "How did you escape?" "A nurse named Mary Catherine took pity on me. She'd seen what the place really was, not a medical facility, but a warehouse for inconvenient relatives that wealthy families wanted permanently removed from society." Grace's fingers worried the fabric of her skirt. "Mary helped me slip away during a transfer between facilities. But I had no money. No friends outside my family's control. Nowhere to turn." "So you tried to survive on your own?" Grace nodded, pain flickering across her features. "I lasted 3 weeks before the men who found me sleeping in their barn decided I was worth more sold than simply returned for whatever reward my family might offer." Samuel's jaw tightened with controlled anger. "They sold you like livestock at market. And you bought me out of kindness when you could have let that drunk rancher take me for breeding stock." Grace looked directly at him, her eyes holding gratitude mixed with something deeper. "You saved my life, Samuel. More than that, you gave me the chance to discover who I really was underneath all the wealth and social expectations." Samuel studied her face in the lamplight from the kitchen window, seeing the same intelligence and quiet strength that had attracted him to Grace Miller, the ranch worker. "What's your full legal name?" "Grace Elizabeth Harrison Maxwell." Grace spoke the name like someone admitting to a burden rather than claiming a privilege. Heir to one of America's largest shipping fortunes, at least on paper. On paper? "My family controls everything through legal guardianship based on my supposed mental incompetence. I have no access to money, property, or business decisions." Grace's voice carried the bitter knowledge of someone who'd learned how easily wealth could become a prison. "I'm rich in name, only a figurehead they can manipulate for their own purposes." Samuel leaned forward in his chair, the wood groaning under his shifting weight. "Grace, I need you to understand something important. I don't care about your inheritance or your family's business empire. You should care." Grace's voice sharpened with urgency. "They'll never stop hunting for me. Samuel, they have resources that most people can't imagine: private investigators, legal connections, political influence that reaches federal courts and territorial governments. Then we'll have to be smarter than their money can buy." Grace's laugh held no humor, only the weary knowledge of someone who'd learned painful lessons about power and its uses. "You can't fight unlimited wealth with good intentions." "Maybe not, but I know someone who might help us level the field." Samuel stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over his land in the gathering darkness. "Judge Morrison in Denver owes me a considerable favor. His son got mixed up with cattle rustlers a few years back. I testified on the boy's behalf, kept him out of territorial prison. One territorial judge can't overturn competency rulings backed by a powerful Eastern family with unlimited legal resources. No, but he can order an independent medical evaluation by physicians with no connection to your family's money. Samuel turned back to face Grace. If we can prove you're mentally competent, their legal authority disappears like smoke. Grace joined him at the porch railing, her presence solid and warm beside him in the cooling evening air. And if the evaluation goes against me, then we disappear, head west to California, where your family's influence doesn't reach, or north to Canada, where American legal documents carry no weight. Samuel's voice carried quiet determination. There are places in this world where a man and woman can build new lives if they're willing to work hard and ask no questions about each other's past. Grace's hand found his on the weathered wood railing, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. You'd give up everything you've built here. This ranch represents years of your life, everything you've worked to achieve. Samuel looked out over his property, the cattle he'd raised, the buildings he'd constructed, the land he'd improved through backbreaking labor under the prairie sun. It represented his entire adult life, every dream he'd pursued since claiming this piece of frontier territory. But the woman standing beside him represented something more valuable than property or achievement or social position. She represented the possibility of partnership with someone who valued his character over his possessions, who'd proven her worth through honest work rather than inherited wealth. Things can be rebuilt. Grace. Land can be claimed elsewhere. Cattle can be raised on different pastures. Samuel's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd finally understood what truly mattered. But finding someone you can trust with your life, someone who sees you as an equal partner that's rare as honest politicians. Grace's grip on his hand tightened, and Samuel felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. I love you, Samuel Carter. The simple declaration hit Samuel with more force than he'd expected. Not the desperate gratitude of someone seeking rescue, but the calm certainty of someone who'd weighed all options and made her choice with open eyes. I love you too, Grace Elizabeth Harrison Maxwell. Samuel turned to face her fully, his free hand cupping her cheek. All of you, the heiress who designed irrigation systems, the servant who saved my cattle, the woman who chose freedom over security. Grace's smile was the first genuinely happy expression Samuel had seen from her since the day her family's carriage appeared on his horizon. What do we do tomorrow? Tomorrow we start fighting back properly. We send word to Judge Morrison. Gather sworn statements from everyone who's witnessed your competence. Build a legal case that you're no more mentally ill than any other woman who refuses to accept male authority over her choices. And tonight, Samuel pulled Grace closer, feeling her warmth against him in the evening air that carried the familiar scents of home prairie grass, cattle, the sweet smell of growing things nurtured by the irrigation channels she'd designed. Tonight we're just Samuel and Grace, sitting on our porch, planning our future together. Our future. If you'll have me as a partner in business as well as in life. Grace turned in his arms, her face lifted toward his in the soft light from the kitchen windows. I've never been anyone's equal partner before. Neither have I. We'll figure it out together, step by step. Samuel bent his head and kissed Grace gently, tasting the salt from tears he hadn't realized she was crying. When they separated, Grace rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing steady and calm for the first time since her family had invaded their peaceful world. Samuel, there's something else you need to know before we face what's coming. Grace's voice carried new tension, the sound of someone preparing to reveal a final, crucial secret. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. wondering what other revelations Grace's complex past might hold. "What is it?" Grace stepped back and reached into her traveling dress, withdrawing a folded document from a hidden pocket sewn into the fabric. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered him the papers. "I didn't escape from that asylum empty-handed." Samuel unfolded the documents, squinting at the legal text in the dim porch light. Even in the darkness, he could make out enough to understand what Grace had given him: financial records, correspondence, contracts between her family and the Morrison Asylum, evidence of bribery, falsified medical reports, and financial arrangements that proved Grace's imprisonment had been purchased rather than medically necessary. Legal proof that Grace Harrison Maxwell had been completely sane when her family had her committed, and that her confinement had been motivated by greed and control rather than genuine medical concern. Samuel looked up at Grace, who watched him with tense expectation, her breathing quick and shallow. "Grace, this changes everything. This isn't just evidence that you're mentally competent. This is proof that your family committed criminal fraud to have you imprisoned." Samuel's voice grew stronger with each word as he grasped the implications. "We're not just fighting for your freedom anymore. We're fighting to put them in prison where they belong." Grace's smile was sharp and dangerous, not the gentle expression of Grace Miller, the ranch worker, but the fierce determination of someone who'd learned to fight back against impossible odds. "Now you understand why they'll never stop hunting me, Samuel. It's not just about controlling my inheritance anymore. It's about keeping their crimes hidden from authorities who might actually prosecute them." Samuel felt a cold smile cross his face as he realized the true scope of what Grace had handed him. She hadn't just escaped from her family's control, she'd stolen the evidence that could destroy them completely, reduce their empire to ruins, and their freedom to memories. The Harrison Maxwell family thought they were hunting a helpless victim who'd temporarily slipped their leash. They had no idea they were chasing someone who held the power to bring down their entire criminal enterprise. The war that was coming wouldn't just be about Grace's personal freedom. It would be about justice itself, whether ordinary people armed with truth could triumph over wealth and corruption that had operated with impunity for years. Samuel looked at Grace with new understanding, seeing her not as the woman who needed his protection, but as the partner who just handed him the weapons they'd need to win the fight of their lives. "Grace Elizabeth Harrison Maxwell," he said quietly. "I think we're going to do just fine." But even as he spoke the words with growing confidence, Samuel heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins: the distant sound of multiple horses approaching fast across the prairie, their hoofbeats carrying the urgent rhythm of riders on serious business. The Harrison Maxwell family had found them again. And this time they weren't coming with legal documents and polite threats. They were coming with enough men and guns to take Grace back by force. Regardless of what anyone might think about the legality of their methods, Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle as he realized that all their plans for legal battles and court proceedings had just become irrelevant. The real war was about to begin, and it would be fought with bullets rather than documents in the darkness of the Colorado prairie. Dear friend, let me share what this story has taught me about the courage it takes to choose love over convention. When I began writing about Samuel and Grace, I thought I was telling a simple tale of rescue and romance. But their story became something deeper, a reminder that true partnership requires seeing past society's labels to recognize the person underneath. Samuel didn't fall in love with Grace Harrison Maxwell, the wealthy heiress. He fell in love with Grace Miller, the woman who found herself through honest work and mutual respect. Grace didn't need rescuing from poverty. She needed freedom to discover who she could become when valued for her contributions rather than her inheritance. Their story speaks to anyone who's ever felt trapped by others' expectations, anyone who's discovered that love means accepting someone completely while helping them become their best self. It reminds us that dignity isn't something you're born with. It's something you earn and give to others through daily choices. In our modern world, where social media often reduces us to our achievements and possessions, Samuel and Grace's journey back to authentic connection feels especially relevant. They chose each other not for what they could gain, but for who they could become together through shared work and mutual respect. Author's note: this story is a work of historical fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. It does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events, is purely coincidental.